Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashalieva, along with co-hosts Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you're joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. We welcome back and are very honored to host again our former contributor, Dr. Taras Kuzio, who joined us from United Kingdom, talking on what the USA administration is doing to stop the war. Dr. Kuzio is professor of the Department of Political Science at National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, associate fellow at the Forum of Foreign Relations, and he authored the book, which was a winner of 2022 Peterson Literary Prize, titled Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War, Autocracy, Orthodoxy, Nationality. The book was published right prior to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Welcome, Dr. Kuzio, and please talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me. I will just give a little kind of update. I've been working very hard with two of my colleagues. This year I will have two books coming out. In I think it's August. They will be published by EBDEM in Germany and Columbia University Press, New York. An edited collection with a colleague in Warsaw, a British colleague in Warsaw called Ian Garner, which is an edited collection of 10 experts writing about Russia as a fascist state. This is a subject that many people don't really want to talk about, including in the academic community, particularly Russianists. But I think it's something that we want to provoke into a discussion, into a debate. Our 10 experts writing about this do this from very many different angles, including Ian Garner and myself. We write about the destruction of Mariupol as a kind of as an example of fascism, whereby Ukraine is destroyed, and on the basis of Ukraine's destruction, Russia rises as a great power. So this is one of the books, Russia as a Fascist State. The second book is written with a Polish colleague based in Krakow, Michał Warzonek, and this is going to be published by Cambridge University Press in December. And this is a book called The Four Roots of the War, The Four Roots of Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, or Russia's war against Ukraine. The reason why this has been provoked is that there have been a hell of a lot of books published on this war, which of course began in February. Well, it began in 2014, but the full-scale war began in February 2022. And I've read a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but I've read probably a majority of them. I've reviewed many of them, and I don't have a good opinion about many of them. A lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon. It's a sexy topic, the war. It's maybe a way to obtain grants or recognition. You become instantly a so-called expert. Most of these authors have never traveled to Ukraine, of course. They don't know the Ukraine language. They tend to always use sources from Russia, not from Ukraine, making them quite lazy, I think. I call this academic Orientalism, because you're looking at the war through the eyes of Moscow. Well, my idea was to bring out the root, what I would call the causes of the war, what brought about the war. And we've divided it into 4 areas. This is like the first area is dealing with what we would call imperial nationalism. So also including areas such as the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and the Russian Orthodox Church. The second area we look at is nostalgia. So particularly the Great Patriotic War, how that has become a religious cult in Putin's Russia, and coupled with that, of course, is the revival of the rehabilitation of Stalin. Included within that section is also the origins of this accusations against Ukraine as a Nazi state. This didn't just begin under Putin. He brought this back from the Soviet Union. Soviet ideological propaganda targeted Ukrainian dissidents at home and the Ukrainian diaspora abroad to a far greater degree than any other nationality in the Soviet Union. They were called Nazi collaborators, CIA agents, etc., etc. The second were the Baltic states. The Russian diaspora was hardly ever attacked in Russian ideological propaganda because Russians, either Democrats or nationalists, never called for the independence of the Soviet Russian Republic from the USSR. The third section deals with what we call divergence, which is how Russia and Ukraine have diverged since 1991, Ukraine becoming a pro-Western democracy. Yes, of course, still a lot to be done, but at least moving in that direction. And let's remember, from the 15 republics of the USSR, only a few of them have actually become democracies. 3 Baltic states, of course, Ukraine and Moldova. That's it. Georgia was also, but it seems to be backsliding now. All the other republics are authoritarian states, or in the case of Russia, fascist dictatorship. And so that divergence, I think, explains a lot between Russia and Ukraine. And the last section looks at what we call the kind of international component. So how all of what we previously talked about is linked to anti-Western xenophobia. And this has a long pedigree, of course, not only because Putin's first big major anti-Western speech was in February 2007, so nearly 20 years ago, but also because Russia's run by the Siloviki, by the former Soviet security forces, KGB and military. So what we would call in political science a militocracy. And that former Soviet military and KGB elite obviously brought from the Soviet Union to contemporary Russia a anti-Western xenophobia. And one of the components of this is that Ukraine is a fake country. It was created by the West to bring or to weaken Russia. It's a kind of invention of the CIA. Yes, I know this sounds crazy, but this is what they think in Moscow. An invention of the CIA, EU, democracy promotion foundations. It's a sort of created as what they call an anti-Russia. This kind of conspiracy theorizing is something that is not new. It began in the late 19th century. Then the culprits were the Austrians and the Poles, who were creating a fake Ukrainian identity to break up this pan-Russian people, the Общерусский народ, composed of great, little, and white Russians. And this has been revived in Putin's Russia. And so the West is to blame, because the West always, according to the ideology of Putin's Russia, the West always tried to put Russia down. The West was always hostile to Russia. The West is, a kind of a Russophobic entity. And its promotion of Ukraine or support for Ukraine is an example of that, allegedly. And so that that aspect of the roots of the war cannot be ignored. And then, of course, that also then brings in Russia's axis of evil, axis of instability, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. All of these countries agree on their anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, their desire to destroy what they call the unipolar world and replace it with something called what they call a multipolar world. And of course, we see North Korean troops and military equipment fighting in Ukraine. And we also see China as the main external military enabler of Russia. China is far greater as a military enabler of Russia than any of the other countries, Iran or North Korea. So that is the fourth, shall we say, route. Now, this brings me on to what Russian, and I'll try to talk about why I think the Trump administration has failed in its attempt to, in its very good idea to try to end the war. Let's remember Trump said that during the election campaign he would end the war within 24 hours, which of course he's completely failed to do. And one of the reasons for that is because when the Russian leaders perennially talk about the roots of the war, the Trump administration have absolutely zero idea what they're talking about. Maybe they think they're talking about root beer. I don't know. But it's certainly, there are complete blank faces in the Trump administration when Russian leaders perennially say we need to resolve the roots of the war before we have a ceasefire. Joking aside, probably many Western European policymakers, maybe not East European, but Western European policymakers also don't quite understand what Russia means by the roots of the war. This is their favorite slogan. We have to resolve the roots of the war. What does that actually mean? What do the Russians mean by the roots of the war? Well, I hope there are some people from the Trump administration watching because they may learn something here. The roots of the war are in many ways quite simple. Russia is basically saying Ukraine cannot exist as Ukraine. Ukraine cannot exist as a Ukrainian state. Ukraine can only exist as a little Russia. And the reason why I say this, and this is usually ignored in most Western commentaries, because it goes too deep. It's too complicated. We are living in the 21st century, and trying to get Westerners to kind of go back in a time machine to the late 19th century is pretty much impossible. But basically, the reason I'm saying this is because the draft so-called peace proposals that Russia proposed in the spring of 2022 have been the exact same ones have been revived now by Russia in these sort of Russian, Ukrainian, American negotiations. And in the Russian document, there are 3 pages of Ukrainian legislation which the Russians demand Ukraine scrubs, that Ukraine annuls. This is unprecedented. A foreign country, can you imagine Mexico, or sorry, the US demanding of Mexico that it changes its legislation, or America of Canada? Russia is demanding that Ukraine annuls this legislation dealing with language, education, culture, religion, and memory politics. And this is 3 pages listed of the laws. Some of these laws go back as far back as 1993, 1994. So what does this mean? It means that Russia wants all of these laws scrapped. Ukraine becomes, and then together with military pressure, regime change, Ukraine becomes de facto another Belarus with a puppet leader beholden to Moscow. That's the goal. All of this is over the heads of the Trump team. It's over the heads, to be honest, of many, as I say, even in Western Europe. But certainly Trump and his, Trump, who prides himself on never reading any books, never even reading his own intelligence briefs that arrive to him every morning. He simply is clueless about these kinds of issues which are driving the Russian military aggression against Ukraine. And so I think that that is one major reason why the so-called talks have not gone anywhere. But I think another reason is that, and here one has to wonder sometimes whether I should be more of a psychologist, not a political scientist, because you are moving into the realm of psychology. Because Trump, who claims he's the best negotiator in the world, has shown himself to be probably the worst negotiator in the world. Not only does he give away potential negotiating issues already to Russia ahead of any talks, like, for example, Ukraine can never join NATO, but also the approach is not balanced. I mean, this is what everybody has pointed out. It's not just me. I mean, this is a commonly held view in Europe and in the United States, that the carrots are for Moscow and the sticks are for Ukraine. The very fact that Trump seems to be unable to apply tough measures against Russia, and Russia therefore has stuck to a very hardline position, which it held in the spring of 22, and it continues to hold. Basically, Russia is demanding Ukraine's capitulation. And that would be fine if Ukraine was on the verge of defeat, but it's not. I mean, no military expert will say that Ukraine's about to be defeated and Russia's about to break through and occupy Ukraine. It's simply not true. So Russian leaders are living in some kind of cloud cuckoo land, with potentially a belief, I think, that they're going to just continue this very slow grinding rate, and lots of people getting killed, and eventually maybe they think they will succeed. But I mean, we're nearly approaching 1 million Russian casualties, that's killed and wounded. That figure will reach 1 million sometime this summer. Putin and Russian leaders in the Kremlin are assuming the Russian people will just continually provide this kind of cannon fodder, what Russians call miaso, meat, for this daily casualty rate, which is about 1,500 a day. Maybe that's not going to be the case, but they assume that's going to be the case, and they also assume that the West doesn't have the staying power on the same level as Russia does. So this is their assumption. I think the other factor involved here is that Trump has this mythical image of Russia as basically the Soviet Union, this powerful entity, this powerful army, powerful state, and he sees the world as dominated by these great powers: China, the Soviet Union, aka Russia, and the US. Well, to be quite honest, of these three entities, these three countries, only China seems to me to be the rising power. Russia is definitely a declining power. Tell me just even one product that Russia exports which is technical, which is technological, which is something modern. Russia doesn't export anything except oil, gas, and weapons. Oil and gas no longer to Europe, and weapons. Who the hell wants to buy very poor quality Russian weapons? China exports modern technology, not only mobile phones, that's cell phones in American, but also it's one of the biggest e-car. It's the competitor to Elon Musk's electronic cars. China is the mass producer of e-cars, so there's simply no comparison. The US is in this maybe transitional phase. It maybe was previously a dominating power, still is, but many argue that its days are numbered where it's the predominant, shall we say, power. But we'll see. At the very least, I would say of the three, China and the US are still powerful. Russia is a declining power, but Trump doesn't see it that way. I think some of the roots of that are partly to be found in how the US and many other Western policymakers got the whole invasion completely wrong. This is a product of, I think, think tanks and policymakers being dominated by Russianists. The Pentagon and the think tanks around Washington, like the Rand Corporation and others, were convinced that Russia would win the war within a few days. It was the same view as in Moscow. They exaggerated Russia's power. They believed that Russia was, in fact, the second best army in the world, and they underestimated Ukraine. And that underestimation of Ukraine continues to this day. We saw that in the Oval Office in February when Trump said to Zelensky, "You don't have any cards. Without us, you're finished." Simply, it shows to what degree they simply, Trump and his team don't get it. They don't understand. American support for Ukraine was very important at the beginning, maybe 2022, 2023. That's no longer the case. And what they also ignore is that this is a two-way process. The US is getting as much from this relationship as Ukraine is getting. There was a very long, big article, a big investigation in the New York Times last year about how the CIA is working on the ground in Ukraine since about 2016. And the amount of intelligence it's getting on Russia is simply too much even for the CIA to deal with. So Ukraine is helping American on that. And also, there are many American defense companies which use Ukraine as the best testing ground in the world for weapons, for modern military technology. Ukraine is a place where you go through different prototypes and eventually get the best one. Ukraine gains from that, of course, because it can, have access to that technology, but so do American defense companies. So that cooperation between Western defense companies, including the US ones, and Ukraine is very deep, and it's actually increasing. I think all of this is simply over the heads of the Trump team. They simply don't get any of this and don't understand how this all works. They see Ukraine as this kind of poor lad on the block, poor boy on the block who is simply coming with a begging bowl. Trump has this image that Zelensky arrives in Washington with an empty shoulder bag and just fills it with cash and takes it back from Washington. Simply doesn't work like that. A huge proportion of the funding set aside for Ukraine on military aid actually goes to American factories to produce the weapons which are replacing the stockpiles which are sent to Ukraine. So that financial aspect of American military aid to Ukraine produces jobs in the US. Again, I think this is beyond their understanding. I think there's maybe one positive outcome of all of this turbulence in the Trump team and its approach to the war and approach to NATO, and that's that finally Europe has had to take care of its to understand it has to increase its commitment to military defense and to its own security. And I think that's coupled with the fact that the West Europeans, here I mean particularly the French and the Germans, because the British have always had more of a viewpoint similar to Eastern Europe. So the French and the Germans have come round to viewing Russia in the same way as East Europeans. Prior to 2022, I think many Europeans, particularly West Europeans, were quite arrogant that, looking down on the East Europeans, saying that you're always talking and complaining about Russia, and in fact, it's not really a major problem. We can deal with Russia, but I think what's changed in the last few years is that the French and Germans, in particular, have now basically adopted the position of the Scandinavians, the Poles, the Baltic states, Czechs, Romanians, that Russia is a major threat, and that if we don't stop Russia and Ukraine, then we are next. And I'll take this to my final point. The problem that lies now, but what that leads to, is that I don't see a Western strategy in the war in Ukraine. I mean, this was always problematical even under Biden, where you had one group of countries, for example, the British, the Scandinavian countries, the Poles, the Baltic states, who openly talked about Russia's military defeat as being their goal, and then Scholz in Germany and Biden in the US never saying that, because they were actually afraid of Russia's military defeat, because this could lead to some kind of civil war in Russia, some chaos surrounding military equipment and nuclear weapons inside Russia. So a similar fear as Bush Sr. in 1990-91 vis-a-vis the pending collapse of the Soviet Union. So what is the goal of the West? If the West really has only two potential goals. And here I mean primarily, of course, Europe here, because Trump seems to be, as it were, on taking the US out of this. I note that the Secretary of Defense, for the first time, missed the Ramstein meeting, the meeting of which is where military aid to Ukraine is coordinated amongst NATO and other allies in a base in Germany. This is the first time US has missed this meeting. Well, there are only two options. One option is that the West or Europe openly comes out and says, we are supporting Russia's military defeat. And the other option is that, we just keep supplying Ukraine with weapons and just let's hope the war just continues in Ukraine and doesn't come back to us. Obviously, from the Ukrainian point of view, the best option is the defeat of Russia, and a very quick defeat of Russia, and an ending to the war. So it's not surprising, therefore, that Zelensky is all in favor of some kind of negotiated agreement to end the war. It's Russia that's a problem here, not Ukraine, but you wouldn't notice that from the Trump team's approach. But I'm very suspicious that the West would actually prefer, or Europe would prefer, or the West maybe, that this would be a forever war, that the war would just continue indefinitely in Ukraine, and then we don't have to think about the bigger picture of what is our main goal. This is a terrible option for Ukraine. A long and drawn-out war for Ukraine is a terrible option for many reasons. It means more Ukrainians, civilians and military, get killed. It means there's further destruction of their country. It means that refugees will never come home from Europe. I mean, there are 6 million Ukrainians abroad. So a forever war is not something that is contemplated by I think policymakers in Kyiv. They want the war to end as quickly as possible. But I'm not sure the Europeans really want to go down that road, because that means basically standing up and saying, we want to support Ukraine to defeat Russia. And what's really happened in the last 3 or 4 years has been that the West has given Ukraine enough weapons to not be defeated, but not enough weapons to defeat Russia. And that I think is a major I think policy mistake. Ukraine will not agree to that. Ukraine will continue to undertake these kinds of daring military missions, like it undertook on June 1st, when these transportation trucks drove into Russia, and from these trucks emerged all of these drones, which destroyed about 40 Russian strategic bombers. Ukraine will continue to undertake these kinds of missions, even though many in the West, including Trump, will think that this is actually quite provocative and is not a good idea. So I think that we are in a bit of a quandary here. The peace process is going nowhere. There are very good senators, Republicans and Democrats, who have prepared very good legislation which would cripple the Russian economy by imposing secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian oil and gas, particularly India and China. But those sanctions will not be introduced until Trump gives the green light. And he seems very reluctant to do anything which hurts Russia. So again, one has to look maybe down the psychologist route here about that. Why is that the case? Because if Trump wants to get Russia to moderate its hardline stance, not change it completely, because that's impossible, but at the very least moderate its hardline stance, the only way that is going to be possible is not by giving Russia carrots, it's by imposing some tough particularly energy economic sanctions on Russia, and giving Ukraine increased military aid. That is the only way that kind of pressure can be exerted on Russia. Up until now, Trump team have been reluctant to do that. Everything is ready. There's cross-party support in both houses of the US Congress for these very tough sanctions. They only need the green light from Trump. So if that doesn't happen, this is just going to continue. And Europe is now stepping up to provide military aid to Ukraine, but more in the form of not sending military equipment, but more in the form of military cooperation, whereby funding is sent to Ukraine. Ukraine builds up military factories and begins producing equipment at home. Either its own Ukrainian equipment or joint production, like, for example, now we will see in the next week or so the production of Ukrainian German missiles in Ukraine. Something like 50% of the military equipment in Ukraine is now produced domestically inside Ukraine. All of this points to the Trump team, when they say Ukraine has no cards, simply not understanding what's happening on the ground and not being able, therefore, to really develop a clear-cut policy towards the war and towards maybe ending the war. So I'm not to be quite frank, very hopeful where that will go. Maybe Trump will give the green light, but he seems to be he has such a deep love fest with Putin that it's difficult to see if that's going to be possible. Let me say this straight away. I don't think Trump is a Russian agent, as some Democrats in the US seem to always try to argue. I think that's too simplistic an answer, and Trump would be a nightmare as a Russian agent. if he was a Russian agent, he would be anti-Russian. He would be acting out his part as a fake anti-Russian, but he's not. I think he's more likely to be a useful idiot than a Russian agent. And the way I say this is that Trump is absolutely convinced that Putin respects him, which is completely untrue. Russian TV on a daily basis mocks Trump. They ridicule Trump. Russian media ridicules Trump. They have their own version of taco. Trump always chickens out. They always have their own version. So Russia does not respect, Putin does not respect Trump. They see him as somebody who always changes his mind, who's weak, who doesn't know what he wants. Trump is convinced that Putin is somehow his friend and his somebody who respects him. That's simply not true. And of course, Putin, being the well-trained KGB agent, uses that to his advantage. He plays on Trump's narcissism. And so Trump goes along with this because he's a useful idiot. I mean, he simply doesn't understand Putin. He doesn't understand that mentality. He sends along his representative Witkoff, who's even worse than him on this narcissism, and who's representative of those kind of pro-Russian Jewish community in Israel, which has led to Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, being very close to Putin as well, because Netanyahu's far-right parties rely on those Russian Jews living in Israel for votes. And I think that in the Kremlin, they must be laughing over their vodka about this. I'll leave it at that. I've talked enough. I've kind of laid out my stable of views as to why I think the peace process hasn't really gone anywhere. Sadly, because I think every Ukrainian would love to have an end to the war. But unless the Trump team, which of course together they can work together with Europeans, adopts a different approach, Putin's going to continue laughing over his vodka in Moscow.
Thank you, Dr. Kuzio. This was remarkable and very, very clear, kind of focusing all the things we have been talking about and thinking about in the last months or so. And I open the discussion. Please, anyone, we have time, open your microphone and ask questions or say something. Please go. I have a lot of questions of my own. Katerina, please.
I really appreciate the comments you said about moving from the realm of political science into psychology to be able to understand some of this. I appreciate so much of what you said, and I've taken copious notes on this and extremely helpful. I understand how at the beginning of this process, because they were relying on information supplied by Russians, that think tanks and whatnot all said, oh no, Ukraine's going to be defeated in a couple of days. Okay, if they believe that in the early days, that's understandable. But every bit of evidence we have, including everything that you've talked about, points now to the fact that that is not the case. So at what point do our elected officials realize that they were making the wrong assumptions starting out? Like at what point, like it doesn't seem from anything you've said that President Trump is going to reconsider his position, but surely that's part of being an intelligent person as far as and being in leadership. As new information comes in, you adjust your position, you adjust your strategy, but that doesn't seem to be happening, nor has it happened in the last 3 years. It seems like the conventional wisdom is, oh no, Ukraine will be defeated, and that's not been really revisited since the beginning of this horrible war.
The only way you can really reply to this is that is by saying, well, Trump is such a narcissist and somebody who's convinced that he knows everything about everything, that he's never going to change his mind and he's never going to read up about any of this. I mean, the joke is he can't read more than half a page.
But aren't there people there? Aren't there people employed to brief him, to give him this information? Surely.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, there's a similarity here to Moscow, where you don't bring bad news to the chief honcho. In the case of in Moscow, you don't bring bad news to a dictator because you could be served bad tea or you could be thrown out of a window. In the case of Trump, nobody's going to bring Trump bad news. I mean, they're all sycophants around him, um, and and they and if they did bring bad news, they would be sacked, and they would. Look at Rubio. He's had to become a sycophant, and even though I'm sure that he's probably the only intelligent guy in that team, and he's very knowledgeable about Russia, and very tough on Russia, very tough on China and Cuba, but he's had to keep a tight lip, right? Because if he doesn't, he's no longer Secretary of State. So I think that's I think an issue. There are lots of congressmen and congresswomen who are very knowledgeable about this question and see that Russia is just laughing at Trump. Again, but we're back to the problem that the Republican Party now is completely controlled by Trump. There's no dissent allowed.
It's
Yeah,
it's
go on.
interesting
Sorry.
because historically, no, I apologize for interrupting, but historically, it is very strange because in American politics, historically, it's been the conservatives, the Republicans who stood up
Yes, yes.
against communism. And my entire generation came of age under Reagan. Grateful to Reagan for basically we felt as the Ukrainian immigrant community that someone was standing up for us, and that continued to be the case until very, very recently. It's flipped. It's completely flipped, where now the Democratic Party is more vocal in support of Ukraine given Russia's aggression. It's just strange. It's just a strange phenomenon. It's completely flipped.
You're absolutely right. Yes, I remember the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, and I mean, he provided extra funding for all sorts of activities, including Ukrainian diaspora groups that were getting American government money. I remember all that. Sure, sure. He gave extra money. He created National Endowment for Democracy, was created under Ronald Reagan. Extra money for Radio Liberty. But that was a different Republican Party. That Republican Party was represented still by the former Vice President Pence, but it's gone. I think it's gone. The Republican Party of today still has, I think, Reaganites. There are a lot of Reaganites there, but they're competing with other people, and I mean, I think this is simply lack of knowledge and unwillingness. I mean, there's one factor I forgot to mention as well in the case of Ukraine, is that Trump probably has also a personal beef, a personal gripe against Zelensky. But let's not forget that he's going to blame Zelensky for his first impeachment. So that probably feeds in as well. But Trump's got this fascination with strongmen, which is ironic because he's a coward. He wouldn't go to Vietnam. He bought a medical certificate so he wouldn't be sent to Vietnam. But he's got this fascination with tough guys. It's what he'd like to be in the US, which is not possible because America's a democracy. But I think all of these factors play in. It's also Trump 2 is different to Trump 1 because Trump 1 in many ways was better than Obama. Trump 1 still had some of that Reaganism was still there. Trump 1 did not veto military aid to Ukraine. Obama did. And Trump 1 also imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which Biden lifted when he was elected. So, but the Trump we have of today is a different animal to Trump 1, I think. This is why I talk about the psychologist part, because his approach is simply illogical. If you really want to get the Nobel Peace Prize and end this war, he's approaching it completely wrong, because he's applying carrots to Russia and sticks to Ukraine. And Ukraine, if there's one trait that every Ukrainian knows about, it's stubbornness. Today, it's called a fancy term, resilience, which is basically Ukrainian stubbornness. Ukrainians have learned to be stubborn because they've been stomped on probably more times than even the Poles next door, because Norman Davies called Poland the playground of Europe, but Ukrainians probably have been invaded far more times than the Poles. So if Trump thinks that Ukrainians are going to bowl over and say, okay, we give up, that he's wrong. He's simply wrong. He's fallen back into that kind of mythology of 3 years ago that the Ukrainians are too weak to sort of take on the Russians. And it's noticeable that when Ukraine did this big operation on June 1st, that Trump was absent for like 3 days. Usually he's very active on social media, and commenting about everything, and he didn't say anything about it. The first time he mentioned it was yesterday when he did this phone call with Putin, and it was like Putin was crying on his shoulders about it.
Hey, the one of the comments that sometimes we hear is well, why like it goes back to everything you're saying about the sticks for Ukraine, carrots for Russia. It also points to that we're giving Ukraine enough weapons to not be defeated, but not enough to defeat, and the whole idea of the forever war being a terrible option. We hear sometimes we get the someone saying something like, well, if Ukraine really wanted peace, they would just give away those territories and everything would be fine. But for a Ukrainian, this is crazy. This does not make any sense at all, and it's almost it's very hurtful, in fact, because Ukrainians are facing daily genocide while people who are completely unaffected by this are making all sorts of suggestions. What do you say to people who pose that argument? Just, well, if Ukraine just really wanted the war to stop, they would just give away Luhansk and whatever.
Well, usually that's said by Russophiles who in 2014 were more vocal than they are today. They're not as vocal today because, of course,
but
all
it's
of
parroted.
Russia's...
It's parroted by poorly educated.
No, it is, but it's also educated by people on the left and Russophiles who don't want to be openly pro-Russian today because it's too embarrassing. And so they say, we're peacemakers. We want to end the bloodshed. And the only way to end the bloodshed is by just Ukraine agreeing to give away these territories. My answer to that is very simple. Firstly, back under Trump 1, the US State Department under Pompeo issued a statement saying that the US will never recognize the Russian occupation of Crimea. That's a document that still stands. So Trump was going to undermine that recently when he talked about recognizing Crimea as Russian. And secondly, if that the reason why the Europeans stand with the Ukrainians on this question and say we cannot agree to de jure legally recognizing these territories as Russian, because it opens up a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
What's next? I mean, for example, Transnistria and Moldova, the region of Narva, Russian-speaking region of Narva in Estonia. I mean, what's next? And Russia knows that. Russia wants that Pandora's box to be opened. And then it also leads, we've already got, for example, Venezuela making territorial claims on its neighbors, using the same kind of spurious arguments. So I think that's a dangerous position. It also undermines the decades-long consensus in international law that the territorial integrity of states is sacrosanct. You can't touch that. And I think that is another factor. Of course, finally, it just rewards military aggression.
Yeah.
So, but I think you're right. One area that you kind of pointed to, which most people kind of ignore, because they, for example, say, well, let's just compare this to East and West Germany in the Cold War. It's not quite like that, because what Russia is doing in the occupied territories is a fascistic de-Ukrainianization. it's transforming those children that is kidnapped into future soldiers of the Russian army to fight against Ukraine. It's destroying Ukrainian identity, language, and culture in the occupied territories and imposing Russification and Sovietization. This is very different, and hence there's no way. I mean, for example, it's destroying monuments to the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, artificial famine of 1932-33, and bringing back monuments of Lenin. So Russia is full steam ahead in Russifying and Sovietizing the occupied territories. And that's simply not something the Ukrainians would agree to, and opinion polls show that they don't agree to that. Finally, Trump's team don't understand that there's such constitution in Ukraine. If Zelensky tomorrow was to say, okay, we recognize Crimea as Russian, he would be impeached by the Ukrainian parliament, because he'd be infringing the Ukrainian constitution, which requires a referendum to be held to decide if there are going to be any territorial changes in Ukraine. But you can't hold a referendum in Ukraine if there's martial law. Because there's martial law is because there's a war on. So you can't have a referendum now during a during a war when there's martial law. So the whole question is simply, it's not possible from a constitutional and legal point of view even as well. So I think it's a non-entity. Ukrainians would never agree to it. All the opinion polls I've seen show, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of Ukrainians opposed to giving away territory. They agree to de facto accept that Russia is occupying, but not to de jure, to legally recognize this as a Russian territory. And this is what Russia's demanding, by the way. One of Russia's hardline demands is that Ukraine recognize Crimea and these 4 oblasts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia as Russian. And there's simply no way that any Ukrainian leader will do that.
Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. One final question, and then I'll yield the floor to others. I'm excited, or not excited. You mentioned there are senators on both sides of the political aisle who have prepped legislation that would actually cripple Russia, and this would really help advance the resolution, advance Ukraine's cause. So what I'm going to do is, I guess it's not so much a question. As our program continues, I'm going to go online and see if I can find those, and then put it in our chat and in our media, so we know to reach out, who those senators are, so we can reach out. I was actually not aware that there is prepared legislation proposals. This is great.
It's prepared, and it's supported by,
as
far as I know, 82 senators from Democrats and Republicans. So it will easily pass. I think that, how many senators are there? 100? 100? Yeah. Well, 82 is a massive majority.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's similar in the House of Representatives as well. So, and just yesterday, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Johnson, said he supported these tough sanctions.
Oh, and Victor, I heard you chime in that Jim Justice, our senator here in West Virginia, is one of them. That is great.
Yes,
that is we've been we've gotten support from our local politicians. We're a small state, but we have a large voice, and we actually our politicians are reachable. Joe Manchin is a huge fan, a huge supporter of Ukraine. So I'm excited to hear that Jim Justice is one of those. All right, I will yield the floor right now.
I think that they all can see that the Russians are just running rings around Trump. It's actually become embarrassing.
It is embarrassing. It is embarrassing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you, Katerina. To say the least, embarrassing. More questions or commentary, please. We have a few minutes.
Yeah, I have. Thank you very much for your very interesting discussion. And in light of the current situation, very unexpected situation in the US, relationship between Russia and Europe is becoming more and more important for the whole world. And besides energy shifts, what was very late, Europe matures together with Europe in understanding what is happening. And I think that Europe is very slow to address Russian threat from the beginning, and now Putin may target Berlin if Ukraine uses German missiles in the near future. So my question is, can Europe defeat Russia without US? And second question, can Europe cooperate with Asian counterparts? For instance, Japan and South Korea, they also have their own interest against Russia. So how Europe can be more leadership, gain more leadership in actually dealing with Russia against against Russia geopolitically. Thank you.
It's always interesting asking somebody from Britain to comment about Europe because, of course, we left Europe in the. I wasn't never a supporter of Brexit, but left Europe. How many years ago now? 9 years ago. But I think what's happened is that Europe has had to become more mature in its. American leaders have always complained about Europe not spending enough on military defense. Not just Trump, Obama also, and previous American presidents complained. Europe is finally now, I think, accepting that. They agreed 10 years ago that every country should spend 2% of GDP on defense. Now they are talking 5%, that this will be the new target. Of the 5%, 3.5 will be on defense and 1.5 will be on related areas, such as, for example, infrastructure. Because what's funny to hear is that many bridges in Western Europe could not keep the weight of tanks if they were drove over them. So those kinds of issues. So that's a big increase. Now, there are some countries already moving ahead. Poland is now the biggest spender in NATO. It's already reaching nearly 5%. Poland on its own. But I think it's not surprising that it takes Europe a long time because there's 30 countries. It's difficult to have a quick consensus. Not all of those 30 countries see Russia as the main threat. For example, Italy, Spain and Portugal maybe see more of threats coming from North Africa, migration, for example, crime, drugs. So that kind of view of Russia is not everywhere inside Europe. But what's happened is that the West Europeans have now, I think, become more supportive of the Scandinavian, the Baltic states, and the Polish view that Russia is a threat. So I think we have positive changes in Germany and France. Also, a positive change is that Britain is now working closely with Europe. So Britain is no longer kind of this Brexit independence. Britain is working, cooperating closely on military affairs with Europe. So I think there's a lot of positive developments there, and especially I think the most important countries for Ukraine have been until now Britain, Germany, 4 Scandinavian countries, 3 Baltic states, and Poland, and the Czech Republic. Sorry, have been in the lead in supporting Ukraine. In terms of other countries that you mentioned, I think both South Korea and Israel are disappointments. South Korea, I simply don't understand what their position is because they seem to be very passive on this question and they don't seem to understand. I mean, why does South Korean intelligence not understand that the North Koreans are training their troops in this war against Ukraine to then be used against South Korea in the future?
Mhm.
This to me seems simple to understand. For me, I'm not an intelligence officer, but this seems like a simple thing to understand. And so if they would understand this, they will be more supporting of Ukraine. But they are blocking any. South Korea is one of the biggest military producers in the world. It's in the top 5 or top 10, I forget. and yet they are blocking any supply of military equipment from South Korea to Ukraine, using the excuse that we don't export to countries in a war. But surely this is an extreme situation. You know, North Korea, the country which is your main existential threat to your country, is fighting. This should allow you to make an exception in your constitution. Israel is also I think for me, a major disappointment because again, I don't understand Israeli intelligence, that they don't understand that there's an Iranian-Russian military alliance. Iran wants to wipe Israel from the face of the earth.
Mhm.
Russia wants to wipe Ukraine from the face of the earth. This, to me, means there should be it's very simple to understand, there should be a military alliance between Israel and Ukraine. But Israel seems to be even reluctant to send defensive equipment, like the Iron Dome air defense system to Ukraine. It's very strange, and the only explanation for that previously was told to me was, oh, Russia's in Syria, Israel's afraid of hurting relations with Russia because Russia's involved with the Assad regime in Syria. But this is not true. I never believed this. And this is not true anymore because the Assad regime was overthrown 6 months ago. So Russia is no longer in Syria. So I think the reasons are other reasons. And one of I think the reasons I've already mentioned is this very large Russian Jewish population inside Israel is pro-Putin. And they watch Russian TV all day. If you go on the internet, you will see billboards from the previous Israeli elections with Netanyahu and Putin holding hands and hugging each other. So Netanyahu saw Putin as an ideological ally, and his supporters on the far right of Israeli politics are many of these Russian Jews. And Vitkov comes from those, shall we say, Brighton Beach, pro-Trump, pro-Russian Israeli Jews. And so I think that's the only explanation which to me explains why Israel has also been a disappointment. I think Europe now will be able to, I think Europe together with Ukraine will be able to continue defending Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. I think and the new model is not sending military equipment to Ukraine. Some of that still goes from particularly Germany and Britain, but it's this provision of money, particularly finances from the frozen Russian assets, money from the interest accrued on the frozen Russian assets. These are $300 billion in primarily held in Belgium. The interest from that is used to be sent to Ukraine, which is then used to build up Ukraine's military industrial complex again. But these defense companies created in Ukraine, which produce a lot of this new military equipment used in Ukraine, either completely Ukrainian or jointly with Western governments, is very different from the old Soviet model, because in the Soviet Union, Ukraine's economy was about 40% military. You had these massive Soviet factories in Ukraine, like in Dnipropetrovsk, which was a closed Soviet city. You had Yuzhmash or Pivdenmash in Ukrainian, which employed 50,000 people, and which was the biggest nuclear weapons factory in the world. It was in Dnipropetrovsk. No, these new modern post-Soviet defense companies in Ukraine, and there's about 300 now in Ukraine. These are small companies, very good on innovation, very good on producing modern equipment, and they sometimes are working with defense companies in the West, particularly from Silicon Valley, for example. And so it's a different type of, shall we say, military enterprises compared to the Soviet Union. So Europe is, I think, helping that. And when the war ends, Ukraine will be in the top 5 military exporters in the world. There's simply no question, because the best testing ground in the world for military equipment is the war in Ukraine. And some commentators have said after the June 1st attacks on Russian strategic bombers that Ukrainian army now is the most innovative army in the world.
Mhm.
Because as a small country compared to Russia, Ukraine has to always think out of the box, has to think, how to defeat Russia in a way which Russia would not think. What helps Ukraine is that Russia is such a mafia state and such a corrupt state that you can sneak into Russia by bribery, corruption, and other ways. Um, and Ukraine is using all of that to its benefits.
Thank you for your brilliant analysis. I really enjoyed your conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzio. Yeah, we can take one more question, please, Yefim.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. A quick comment, and then maybe sort of like a hypothesis. Yes, we can imagine an American president demanding constitutional changes of its neighbors, Canada, Greenland, right? Now, the hypothesis I have is that I think that while Trump was bragging about 24 hours and solving the Ukrainian problem, he was never particularly sort of into it. It's not a sexy thing for his base, so he kind of bragged about it. And by now, he sort of sees that there is no gain either way for him, and in particular for his base. And he's kind of putting it in the back burner and turning to his marquee things, which are tariffs and immigration, especially for his base. And he, of course, had a defeat on tariffs a week ago. And for that court case, my son was the lead lawyer. So that's what I think. So he's kind of like, okay, it didn't work. I like Putin, but it doesn't go, can't do anything. I just don't care about it anymore that much. What do you think about this?
Well, this would be, yes, potentially an explanation, because he's obviously somebody with a very short attention span. But he's got it's not just the Ukraine-Russian war he doesn't understand or doesn't want to get, as Americans say, doesn't want to get into the weeds about this problem. He doesn't understand the Gaza question, the whole conflict in Gaza. He doesn't understand India-Pakistan either. And so it's an unwillingness to actually try to analyze or try to read up or try to be informed about these conflicts. In the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, he could be successful. I mean, his approach has been terrible, but he could still be successful in terms of moderating Russia's maximalist demands, as I've mentioned. And the only way to do that is to stop giving Russia carrots, to stop, hitting Ukraine over the head with the sticks and giving Russia the carrots, to give the green light to these sanctions created in the U.S. Senate, which then would be replicated in the House of Representatives, and Russia will be crippled by these. We're talking 500% sanctions on secondary buyers of Russian oil and gas. Without that money coming into the Russian budget, it's difficult to see how Russia could continue fighting. Now, I'm always a bit skeptical, because Putin, again, if we're talking about political science or psychology, Putin's not a rational actor either. It's difficult to see, he doesn't really care about Russian casualties. He doesn't care if it's 1 million people have died. He has no conscience or soul about that. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about Ukrainian lives, doesn't care about Russian lives. and he doesn't seem to care about that he's dragging the Russia backwards, and in his war. But if you want to at least give it a try, Trump could give the green light to these sanctions, and maybe Russia would be forced to moderate its maximalist stance. At the moment, Russia is laughing at Trump. Russia is not taking Trump seriously as negotiating partner. Trump has made various threats against Russia, which he's never followed through on. So Russia doesn't take him seriously. And Ukraine accepts ceasefires, Russia does not. How to change that dynamic? There's only really two options. Trump walks away, but I think that's going to be quite embarrassing for him, because that will constitute a failure. And let's remember that Trump always criticized Biden for the failure of Afghanistan. This will be an even bigger failure for him in Ukraine than Afghanistan was for Biden. Or the other option is to give it a try, to try and use some sticks against Russia. So really the ball is in Trump's court. And it's difficult to, nobody can really understand or explain why Trump is so reluctant to be tough on Russia. As I say, I don't think it's because he's a Russian agent. There are other factors here at work. But this cannot continue indefinitely. Either he has to walk away or he has to be tough. There is no really other option. We shall see in the next few weeks. I mean, Ukraine's done everything that Trump wanted. It signed the minerals agreement, even though that to me is simply a bit of a joke, because every expert will tell you that it's going to take at least 15 years for those rare minerals to be taken out of the ground, through finding investment, building mining, bringing in mining equipment, creating mines. It takes at least 15 years. So Trump will not be president anymore if any money comes from that agreement. He might not even be around. But that agreement was signed for the MAGA voters to show MAGA voters that, look, Biden gave away everything free. I got something back, even though it's a complete myth. So we shall see. Ukraine's done everything that Trump has demanded. It's agreed to have a ceasefire, agreed to these agreements. Russia has not, and yet Ukraine is the one that keeps getting hit by sticks by the Trump administration.
Yeah, he seems to be more excited about, Mickey Mouse minerals and the plane from Qatar. Yes. Thank you.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzio. We have been here over the hour. Thank you for your time and expertise. We will be watching the news and hope for something to be defined in the next few days and weeks. We know we live in a very strange time in this history.
We do.
Thank you very much for being with us this hour. This was 171st weekly podcast of MUkraine Group at Marshall University, West Virginia. And I will ask Dr. Shrey to say a few words if
Дорогі
she is
браті
with
і
us.
сестри,
Yes, please.
дорогі браті і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні.
Героям
слава.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Let's keep watching this spot.
Thank you, everyone.